The Arizona sun has a way of baking secrets right into the dust. And in 1878, the town of Redemption Gulch had a secret it just loved to tell. It was the story of Elias Thorne, a man whose face was as cracked and weathered as the bluffs he ranched on. A man who spent his last few dollars not on seed or cattle, but on a wife. A wife he bought from a cage. The townsfolk laughed, they pointed. They called her Thorne's Folly, a broken, silent savage. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the silence behind her lips was a lock, and that the key to that lock was a secret so powerful it would make the most feared Apache chief in the territory fall to his knees and weep like a child. This is the story of how a single word can shatter the world. Redemption. Gulch was where hope came to get a suntan and die of thirst. The heat was a living thing, a monster that wrapped itself around the clapboard buildings and turned Main Street into a choking, gritty powder. It was a hard place for hard men, and their favorite pastime was chewing up and spitting out anyone who showed a hint of weakness. And that Tuesday, they had fresh meat. Elias Thorne was carved from the same rock and dust as the landscape around him. His hands were a roadmap of scars from breaking wild horses and mending fences on a ranch that was always one dry season away from turning to dust. He was a quiet man, haunted by a war he'd fought a decade ago. A war that had stolen his smile and left him with a silence the loud mouse in town mistook for being soft. 2 days ago, he'd ridden out, not west to the cattle markets, but east, toward the lawless, blood-soaked outpost of Serpent's Tooth. He didn't come back with a prize bull. He came back with a woman. She wasn't some mail-order bride full of nervous chatter and dreams of a white picket fence. This woman was different. He'd found her locked in a wagon cage, put on display by a greasy trader named Silas Croft, a man whose soul was as yellow as his teeth. Croft called her a tamed savage, a prize from some raid he'd claimed. She was utterly silent. Her long dark hair was a curtain hiding a face of sharp, angular beauty, but it was her eyes. Her eyes were the color of dark honey, and they held a stillness that was deeply unsettling. They saw everything. They revealed nothing. "She don't speak," Croft had sneered, rattling the bars of her cage for the entertainment of the crowd. "Took a blow to the head, I reckon. Or maybe she's just plain stubborn. But she's strong, good for work, and she won't ever talk back. What more could a man ask for, eh?" The crowd of grimy men had laughed, their eyes crawling all over her like flies on meat. But Elias saw something else. He saw the fire of defiance in the set of her jaw. He saw an unbroken spirit staring out from behind those unblinking eyes. He saw a soul in a cage, and it looked a lot like the one he carried around inside himself. He paid Croft's outrageous price, every last cent he had, the money that was supposed to buy seed for the winter, and he led her away, not with a rope, like an animal, but with a quiet gesture of his hand. Their arrival back in Redemption Gulch was a spectacle. Bartholomew Slocum, the fat, arrogant cattle baron, whose land dwarfed Elias's tiny plot, was the first to throw a stone. He stood on the porch of the general store, his fancy waistcoat stretched tight over his whiskey gut. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." Slocum's voice boomed across the dusty street. "Thorne's finally gone and bought himself some company. Can't say I blame the lonely fool, but I thought you'd have better taste, Elias. At least get one that can say yes." A wave of cruel, braying laughter followed. Elias didn't even look at them. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. The woman, whose name he didn't even know yet, walked beside his horse, her bare feet silent in the dust. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her composure was a fortress made of stone. Elias helped her onto the seat of his buckboard, his touch on her arm surprisingly gentle, and drove them out of town. The sound of their mockery trailed behind them like a bad smell. Thorne's Folly. That's what they called her from that day on. The name stuck like a burr. Elias Thorne, the fool who bought himself a broken, silent bride. His ranch wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own two hands, a barn that leaned a bit, and a corral. It was harsh country, but it had a severe beauty to it. He led her to the cabin door. "This is your home now," he said, his voice rough from not being used much. You are not a slave here. You are safe. You have your own room. You don't have to do anything you don't want to." She looked at him, a long, searching look. He couldn't read it, but he knew one thing. There was no fear in it, only a deep, unnerving watchfulness. She stepped inside the cabin. He'd set up the small spare room for her with a simple cot and a clean blanket. She went into the room and gently closed the door. That night, Elias sat on his porch, feeling a loneliness so heavy it felt like it could crush his ribs. He had lived in silence for years, but this new silence inside his own home was different. It was alive. It was breathing. It was watching him. He looked up at the endless sea of stars and wondered, had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Or had he, for the first time since the war, finally done something right? The town could laugh all it wanted. He'd seen enough of the world to know that the things people mocked were often the only things with any real value. Days turned into weeks. The silence between Elias and the woman he started calling Alara, a name he'd read in a book once, a name that sounded both soft and strong, that silence became its own language. It was a language spoken when he found a cup of coffee left for him on the porch rail at sunrise. It was spoken in the bowl of wild berries she'd leave on the table for him when he came in from a long day's work. It was in the shared glances across the small cabin, a silent understanding passing between two people who the world had tried to break. Elias never pushed her to speak. He talked to her as if he expected an answer, but he never showed an ounce of disappointment when one never came. He'd tell her about his day, about a stubborn calf, about the way the setting sun painted the canyon walls in strokes of orange and purple. He told her about his parents, who died of fever on the trail out west. He even told her about the war, something he'd never spoken of to another living soul. He talked about it in short, clipped sentences, like he was pulling splinters out of his own memory. "They told us we were fighting for a noble cause," he said one night, cleaning his rifle by the firelight while she mended one of his shirts. "But all I saw was boys killing other boys. We all spoke the same language, but we stopped listening. Maybe, maybe silence is better sometimes." When he said that, her hands, which had been moving with a quick rhythmic grace, paused for just a second. She lifted her gaze from her work and met his. In her eyes, he didn't see pity. He saw understanding, a deep, chilling understanding. It was the look of someone who had seen her own kind of war, her own kind of senseless violence. Alara began to change the small cabin, to change the land around it. She had a knowledge of the wild that was nothing short of astonishing. She would vanish into the sagebrush for an hour and come back with roots that, when boiled, made a soothing balm for his rope-burned hands. She found herbs that kept the swarms of insects at bay. She wove river reeds into baskets so strong and beautiful they looked like they belonged in a fine city home. She was not the broken, helpless creature the town imagined. She was a survivor. She possessed a quiet, powerful competence that made the gossiping hens of Redemption Gulch look like fools. But the town wasn't ready to see that, and Bartholomew Slocum was just waiting for a chance to prove Elias was a fool. That chance came one sweltering afternoon. Elias was in the corral, trying to break a fiery young Mustang he'd captured. The horse was a whirlwind of muscle and panic, bucking and rearing, its eyes white with fear. Elias had been thrown 4 times already. The 5th time, he landed hard. The wind knocked clean out of him. He just lay there in the dust, defeated. And of course, that's when Slocum and a few of his ranch hands chose to ride by. They sat on their horses by the fence line, their laughter loud and grating. "Can't even handle a horse, Thorne," Slocum bellowed, his voice dripping with scorn. "How do you expect to handle a wife, especially one who can't even tell you when you're doing it wrong?" A hot flush of shame and anger burned in Elias's gut. He was about to get up and order them off his land, but before he could, the corral gate creaked open. Ilara slipped inside. She moved without a sound, her presence radiating a strange, powerful calm. The wild Mustang, which had been fighting Elias with every fiber of its being, stopped its frantic dance. It stood dead still, watching her, its ears swiveling, its nostrils flaring. She didn't approach it head-on. She walked in a slow, patient circle, her body relaxed, her gaze soft. And then she began to hum. It was a low, melodic sound. Not quite a song, more like the sound of wind whispering through ancient pines. It was the first sound he had ever heard her make. The melody was haunting, ageless, and it seemed to settle over the dusty corral like a cool blanket. The Mustang lowered its head. The trembling in its powerful legs subsided. She kept circling, getting closer with each pass, her humming a constant, soothing presence. Finally, she was close enough to reach out. She didn't touch its head or its neck. She laid a hand on its powerful shoulder. It was a gesture of respect, not of dominance. The horse shuddered once, then stood perfectly still, actually leaning into her touch. From the fence line, the laughter had died. Slocum and his men were watching, their mouths hanging open in stunned silence. Elara looked from the horse to Elias, a clear question in her eyes. He rose slowly, brushing the dust from his clothes, and walked toward her. She took his hand, and she placed it on the Mustang's neck, right next to her own. The horse didn't move a muscle. That day, Elias rode the Mustang. Slocum and his men rode away without another word, their faces a twisted mask of confusion and grudging awe. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky turn a bruised purple, Elias looked at her, his heart filled with a feeling he couldn't quite name. It was more than gratitude. It was a deep, profound respect. "How did you know how to do that?" he asked softly. She didn't answer with words. She just looked out at the darkening landscape, at the land she seemed to know like the back of her own hand. Her answer was in the quiet strength that radiated from her, in the gentle breeze that rustled the cottonwood leaves. And Elias was beginning to understand. Her silence wasn't empty. It wasn't an absence of words. It was a presence of something deeper, something older, something the loud, brittle world of Redemption Gulch could never, ever comprehend. He realized he was no longer just protecting her. He was learning from her, and he was falling in love, not with the idea of a wife, but with the silent, powerful woman who was teaching him a whole new way to listen to the world. But as the seasons changed, so did the feeling in the air. The whispers in town were about to become a roar. The hot winds of summer gave way to the sharp, dry winds of autumn. And with the changing season came a new kind of tension in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the coming cold. It started as a trickle, frightened prospectors and weary travelers bringing stories into Redemption Gulch. Stories of Apache raids. Now this wasn't unheard of. The territory was a constant simmering pot of conflict between settlers and the native tribes. But this was different. The attacks were bolder, more vicious, more desperate. A stagecoach ambushed and burned. A remote homestead left as nothing but smoking cinders. And the war parties were all being led by one man, a chief the settlers called Stoneheart. They said he was a strategic genius, and his ferocity in battle was legendary. But they also whispered that he wasn't fighting for land. He was searching for something, or someone. That his rage was fueled by a terrible personal loss, a wound in his soul that would not heal. In Redemption Gulch, fear spread faster than a brush fire, and like any sickness, it needed someone to blame. The town's fearful, hateful gaze fell on the small, isolated ranch at Thorn Creek, and on the strange, silent woman who lived there. "She's a bad omen," declared Martha Higgins, the storekeeper's wife, her voice a shrill poison that dripped through the general store. "Ever since Thorn brought that savage here, the trouble's gotten worse. It's unnatural. A woman who don't speak." Bartholomew Slocum, always the opportunist, fanned the flames of paranoia. He saw his chance, a chance to finally run Elias Thorn off the land he'd wanted for years. "She's one of them, I tell you," Slocum proclaimed from his usual throne at the saloon, a glass of whiskey held high. "Thorn is harboring an Apache spy. She's probably signaling them right now from that ranch of his, telling them where to strike next." The accusation was insane, but fear is fertile ground for insane ideas, and the seeds of suspicion Slocum planted grew into a thorny bush of pure hatred. Elias wasn't blind to it. When he rode into town for supplies, conversations would stop dead. Men who'd known him for years would turn their backs. The town sheriff, a man named Alistair Beaumont, whose spine was made of cooked noodles, would just give him a weak nod and then suddenly find some urgent business to attend to on the other side of the street. The sheriff wasn't a bad man, but he was a politician, and the political winds were blowing a hurricane straight at Elias Thorne. One day, Elias came back from town to find Alara standing on the ridge behind their cabin. She was looking east, toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, the heart of Apache territory. She stood so still, so rigid, her focus so absolute that she didn't hear him approach. There was a profound sadness in her posture, a longing so powerful it was almost painful to look at. And Elias had a chilling thought. She wasn't just looking at the mountains, she was listening to them. The tension on the ranch was a mirror of the tension in the territory. Elias started sleeping with his rifle beside his bed again, a habit he thought he'd left behind with the war. He wasn't afraid of an Apache attack. His ranch was poor, with little to raid. No, he was afraid of the men from Redemption Gulch. Ilara seemed to sense it too. She became even more watchful, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She started teaching him things. How to read the signs of the land. A broken twig that meant a man, not an animal, had passed. The agitated flight of a flock of birds that warned of a predator nearby. She was teaching him to see the world as she did, a living thing, full of whispers and warnings. Then one crisp afternoon, while checking a fence line down by the creek, Elias found it. A single black feather, tied to the wire with a strip of red sinew. It wasn't from any local bird. It was stark, deliberate, a marker, a message. He took it back to the cabin and held it out for Alara to see. The moment she saw it, something flickered across her face. Recognition? Fear? Sorrow? He couldn't tell. Her mask of perfect calm slammed back into place in a heartbeat. She took the feather from his hand, her fingers tracing its sharp edges. Then she walked to the fireplace and without a single word dropped it into the flames. She watched it burn until it was nothing but a wisp of gray ash. She turned to face him. Her eyes were clear, but they held a new and terrible urgency. She walked to the cabin's heavy wooden door and slid the bolt across. It was a simple gesture, but it was the first time she had ever done it, and it was a clear, unspoken statement. The world was done whispering about them from a distance. The danger was coming closer. The storm of hatred brewing in Redemption Gulch was about to break, and it was going to break right over their heads. Bartholomew Slocum was a master at playing the fiddle of fear, and by now he had the entire town of Redemption Gulch dancing to his tune. He painted Elias not just as a fool, but as a traitor, a man in league with the very savages that were terrorizing the territory. Stoneheart's warriors burned the Miller homestead to the ground last night, Slocum announced to a grim-faced crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. His voice was thick with fake grief that barely concealed his triumphant opportunism. They're getting closer. And why? Because they have an ally in our midst, a man who shelters one of their own, who gives them a safe haven to spy on us all. He didn't need to say Elias's name. Every single eye in that crowd turned to the east, toward the small, isolated ranch by Thorn Creek. Sheriff Beaumont came out of his office, his face pale and sweating. Now, Bart, that's a serious accusation. We have no proof. Proof? Slocum scoffed, turning on the sheriff like a rabid dog. The proof is in that silent witch he keeps. While we bury our dead, he's cozying up to one of them. Are we going to wait until our own homes are cinders? Until our own children are stolen? I say no. If the law won't protect us, then we, the good men of this town, will protect ourselves. A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Fear had curdled into mob justice. Men who were just farmers and shopkeepers a week ago were now a grim-faced posse, their eyes lit with the fire of righteous fury. Sheriff Beaumont tried to plead for reason, but his voice was swallowed by the roar. He was a man trying to hold back a flood with a tin bucket. Ellis saw them coming from a mile away, a rising cloud of dust on the horizon, too big for just a few riders. He was on the roof of the barn, mending a loose shingle, and he froze, his hammer held in midair. He recognized Slocum's big bay stallion at the head of the pack. This wasn't a social call. This was an army. He scrambled down the ladder, his heart pounding a frantic drum against his ribs. "Elara!" he yelled, his voice sharp with alarm as he burst into the cabin. She was already at the window, watching them approach. There was no panic on her face, only a grim, settled resolve. It was the look of a person who had been expecting this moment their entire life. She looked at Elias, and in her eyes he didn't see a woman who needed saving. He saw a partner, ready to face the storm with him. He grabbed his Winchester rifle from the rack over the fireplace and a box of cartridges. "Get to the root cellar," he ordered. "The door is thick. Stay there no matter what you hear." She shook her head, a small, firm gesture. Then she pointed. To the back window, then down to the creek bed, then to the high rocks beyond it. It was an escape route, a route for him. She was telling him to save himself. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice low and fierce, the conviction in his own words shocking him. When had this silent woman become the anchor of his entire world? He would not, could not, abandon her. Her expression softened for just a fraction of a second. A look of gratitude and of deep sorrow that he was now tied to her fate flashed across her face. Then the resolve returned. If he would not run, she would not hide. She picked up the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. A poor substitute for a weapon, but she held it like a queen holding a scepter. The posse, a chaotic mob of 20 men, thundered into the yard, trampling the small herb garden Alara had so carefully tended. They surrounded the cabin, their faces twisted masks of anger and fear. Slocum swung down from his horse, a shotgun held loosely in his hand. "Thorn!" he bellowed. "Come on out! We've come for the Apache witch!" Elias stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester held ready but pointed at the ground. "This is my property, Slocum. You and your men have no business here. Turn around and go home." "We ain't going anywhere without the squaw," another man shouted. "Hand her over, and we'll leave you be." "She is my wife," Elias said, his voice ringing with a cold authority that surprised even himself. "She is under my protection, and you will leave my land. Now." Slocum let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "Wife? You call that thing a wife? We're here to do what our cowardly sheriff won't. Give her to us, or by God, we'll burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside it." Elias raised the Winchester. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back echoed in the sudden, tense silence. "The first man who takes another step," Elias said, his voice deadly calm, "is a dead man." The standoff was absolute. The air crackled. The men in the posse shifted, their mob bravado starting to crumble in the face of Elias's cold determination. They were farmers, not killers. But Slocum was a different animal. His eyes glittered with pure malice. This was about more than just Alara now. This was about breaking the one man in the valley who had ever stood up to him. "You're a fool, Thorn," Slocum snarled, raising his own shotgun. "You're choosing a savage over your own kind." From inside the cabin, Alara watched, her knuckles white around the iron poker. She saw the pure hatred in Slocum's face and the unwavering courage in Elias's stance. He was standing between her and a world that wanted her dead. A lone warrior against an army of hate. The fortress of silent grief she had built around her heart for so many years finally began to crack. And through that crack shone a fierce, desperate light. It was love. A love for the quiet, honorable man who was willing to die for her. The sun beat down, turning the dusty ranch yard into a furnace. Elias held the Winchester steady, his sights centered on Slocum's chest. The other men fidgeted, their courage evaporating. "Last chance, Thorn," Slocum growled. "Get off my land," Elias repeated. It was a flicker of movement from the edge of the crowd that broke the spell. A nervous young farmer, caught up in the frenzy, raised his pistol. Maybe he just meant to fire a warning shot into the air, but his hand was trembling. The shot went wide, splintering the porch post just inches from Elias's head. The gunshot shattered the tense quiet like a pane of glass. It was the spark the powder keg needed. The posse, thinking Elias had fired, raised their own weapons. Elias dove back from the porch just as a volley of lead ripped through the air, tearing the front of his cabin to shreds. Inside, Alara was thrown to the floor by the impacts. Wood splintered around her, the window shattered. For a horrifying moment, she was back in another time, another place of chaos and violence. The air thick with screams and gunpowder. The trauma that had stolen her voice threatened to paralyze her. But then she heard Elias cry out, a sharp grunt of pain. Peeking through the shattered window, she saw him. He was crouched behind an overturned water trough, a dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. He was hit. Seeing him wounded, bleeding, broke the icy grip of her past. Terror was burned away by a cold, protective fury. The men outside were no longer a faceless mob. They were a direct threat to the only person in this cruel world who had ever shown her kindness. Elias returned fire, his shots precise, deliberate. He wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting to intimidate, aiming for hats, for the water barrels they used as cover. His war training came rushing back. Conserve ammunition, use cover, make one man seem like five. Slocum's men, disorganized and leaderless, fell into disarray. They were used to being the hunters, not the hunted. "Spread out! Surround the cabin!" Slocum roared, trying to regain control. He can't watch every direction at once. As the men began to move, Elara acted. While Elias kept the men at the front pinned down, she slipped out the back door, silent as a ghost. She crawled on her belly through the tall grass behind the barn, the iron poker clutched tight in her hand. She saw two of Slocum's men trying to sneak around the side of the barn to get a clear shot at Elias's flank. They moved like clumsy cattle, whispering loudly. Elara moved behind them, her bare feet making no sound on the dry earth. She waited until they were just past a tall, precariously stacked pile of firewood. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed. The heavy logs tumbled down with a tremendous crash, startling the men and trapping one by the leg. His scream of pain and surprise drew everyone's attention. Elias used the diversion, firing two quick shots that sent Slocum and his closest men scrambling for better cover. The fight devolved into a chaotic exchange of gunfire, the air growing thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Elias, bleeding and growing weaker, knew he couldn't keep this up for long. They had the numbers. It was only a matter of time. Elara, meanwhile, had made her way to the creek bed. She knew a spot where the banks were steep and slick with moss. Working with frantic speed, she used the iron poker to dislodge a huge section of the overhang. A small landslide of mud and rock tumbled down, blocking the path for the men trying to circle around from the south. She wasn't a warrior. She fired no gun, wielded no blade. Her weapons were her knowledge, her silence, and her fierce, desperate ingenuity. She was turning the very land they stood on against them, but Slocum was relentless. He saw Elias starting to sag behind the water trough, his rate of fire slowing. "He's hurt!" Slocum bellowed, his courage returning. "Press him! He's finished!" Slocum himself led a charge, running from behind a wagon straight toward the porch. Elias raised his Winchester, his vision starting to blur from blood loss. He squeezed the trigger. Click. Empty. A cruel, triumphant grin spread across Slocum's face as he leveled his shotgun. This was it. The end. Elias closed his eyes, his last thought a regret that he had brought this destruction down upon the silent woman he had tried so hard to save. Then he heard a sound. Not the blast of a shotgun he was expecting. It was a low, powerful thrumming, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, the sound of deep-throated war cries and the thunder of 100 unshod hooves. Slocum froze, his shotgun still aimed at Elias. His grin faltered, replaced by a look of disbelief and pure, stark terror. The men of his posse lowered their weapons, their faces turning ashen. On the ridge to the east, silhouetted against the blood-red setting sun, a line of riders had appeared. They were not settlers. They were lean, powerful men with long hair and faces painted for war, holding lances and bows. At their head was a tall, imposing figure, whose presence commanded absolute authority. It was Stoneheart and his Apache war party. They had been drawn by the sound of the gunfire, coming to investigate the battle raging in the valley. The siege at Thorn Creek had a new, terrifying audience, and the hunters from Redemption Gulch had just become the hunted. The arrival of the Apache war party plunged the valley into a dead, suffocating silence. The gunfire stopped. The shouts died in men's throats. Slocum's posse, which seconds before had been a roaring fire of arrogant fury, was now just a scattered group of terrified men, trapped. Trapped between the man they'd come to kill and a force they had only ever known in their worst nightmares. Elias, still slumped behind the water trough, could only watch, his rifle useless. He saw the warriors not as faceless savages, but as what they were, master horsemen, disciplined, deadly. Their eyes taking in the scene below with cold, assessing intelligence. The chief, Stoneheart, was magnificent and terrible all at once. He sat on his war pony, his face a mask of stern authority, but it was a mask etched with lines of grief so deep they looked like canyons. He scanned the chaos, the bullet-riddled cabin, the terrified townsman, the bleeding man on the ground. His gaze missed nothing. Slocum, recovering from his initial shock, made a fatal mistake. Thinking he could find a common enemy, he shouted up at the ridge, his voice cracking with fear. "We're settlers! He's the enemy! Help us!" Stoneheart's gaze flickered to Slocum, and it was filled with a contempt so profound it was like a physical blow. Men like Slocum had been hunting his people for years. The plea was not just ignored, it was a profound insult. Then, from the shadows of the ruined cabin porch, a figure emerged. It was Alara. She walked out into the dying light, the iron poker still clutched in her hand. Her face was smudged with dirt, her dress was torn, but she moved with an impossible regal calm. She ignored the posse. She ignored the bleeding Elias. Her eyes were fixed on only one man, the chief on the ridge. Stoneheart saw her, and the world simply stopped. The stoic mask on the chief's face shattered. His jaw went slack. A storm of emotions, disbelief, agony, a dawning impossible hope, warred in his eyes. He let out a choke sound, a guttural cry that wasn't a war whoop. It was a name torn from the very depths of his soul, a name in a language the settlers couldn't understand, a name that meant mourning dove. He urged his horse forward, not charging, but in a slow, hesitant descent down the ridge. His warriors stayed behind, weapons ready, watching their leader with a mixture of reverence and confusion. Alara stood her ground in the center of the yard. As the chief drew closer, the men of the posse could see it, the resemblance, the same high cheekbones, the same proud set of the jaw, the same dark, honey-colored eyes that saw everything. The words savage and witch died on their lips, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. She wasn't just an Apache, she was his. Stoneheart dismounted a dozen feet from her. This was the great chief, the man whose name brought terror to the entire territory. But as he stood before the silent woman, he was just a father. He took a faltering step forward. "Mourning dove," he whispered, his voice thick with years of unshed tears. "Is it truly you?" He spoke of her capture, years ago, in a brutal raid by soldiers on their peaceful winter camp. He spoke of searching for her, of his heart turning to stone in his chest when all hope seemed lost. He told her that her mother had died of grief a season later, and that his war across the territory was not for land, but a campaign of sorrow, a father's mad, raging quest for a ghost. Ilara listened, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Recognition. Love for the father she thought she'd lost forever. But there was also the shadow of her trauma, the violence that had stolen her voice, the cage, the mocking faces. It was all a wall of ice around her heart. She wanted to speak his name, to run to him, but the bridge from her mind to her lips was broken. Tears streamed down her face, but no sound came out. Elias watched from the ground, his own pain forgotten. He finally understood everything. Her knowledge of the land, her way with the horse, the deep sadness in her eyes. She wasn't broken. She was exiled. He saw the chief's raw agony and the torment on Alara's face. But Bartholomew Slocum saw none of the human drama. He only saw an opportunity. The great chief was distracted, vulnerable. In his panicked, hateful mind, a twisted idea formed. Kill the chief. Be a hero. Slowly, while all eyes were on the reunion, Slocum began to raise his shotgun. He brought the stock to his shoulder, the twin barrels aiming directly at Stoneheart's exposed back. Only Elias saw it. Lying on the ground, his senses screaming from pain and adrenaline, he caught the subtle movement. He saw the glint of the setting sun on the gun barrels, the tightening of Slocum's finger on the trigger. No time to shout, no time to find a weapon, only time for instinct. With a roar born of desperation and a fierce, protective love, Elias launched himself forward. He ignored the fire in his shoulder and slammed his body into Slocum's side just as the man fired. The shotgun blast erupted with a deafening boom, but instead of tearing into the chief's back, the pellets ripped harmlessly into the dirt. Elias's tackle sent both men sprawling. Slocum, enraged, rolled over and brought the heavy stock of his gun down hard on Elias's head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. And then, for Elias, there was only darkness. The scene froze for a single, silent heartbeat. Stoneheart spun around, his face a mask of pure fury. His warriors on the ridge raised their bows as one, arrows aimed at the stunned townsman. But it was Elara who moved first. Seeing Elias fall, seeing him sacrifice himself for her father, it was the final blow that shattered the wall of ice around her heart. The years of trauma, the forced silence, the crushing weight of her grief, it was all incinerated in a single blazing moment of pure emotion. A sound tore from her throat, raw and powerful, a cry of anguish, of love, of a voice that had been caged for years and was now breaking free. It was not her Apache name. It was not a plea to her father. It was the name of the man who had looked at her and seen a person, not a possession. The man who had given her a home, not a prison. The man who had just laid down his life for her. Elias! Her voice rang out across the valley, clear and strong, filled with a desperate clarity that cut through the tension like a knife. It was the first word she had spoken in years, and it was his name. Stoneheart and his warriors froze. They had expected to hear their own tongue, to hear her call out for her father. But to hear her cry out this English name, the name of a white man, with such profound love and despair, it changed everything. They did not see an enemy bleeding on the ground. They saw the man their lost princess loved, the man who had just saved their chief's life. They lowered their weapons. Stoneheart stared at his daughter, then at the unconscious form of Elias at her feet. The tears he had held back for so many years finally fell, streaming freely down the deep lines of his face. He wasn't crying for the daughter he had lost. He was crying for the woman she had become, a woman who had found a new life, a new protector, a new love, in the heart of the very world that had taken her from him. He cried for the sorrow of the past and for the complex, painful beauty of the present. The men of the posse stood in stunned, shamed silence. The silent witch had a voice, and its first word was an expression of love for the man they had tried to murder. The savage chief wept like any grieving father. Their entire world of simple hatreds and self-righteous excuses had been demolished in an instant. They looked at their own hands, at Slocum, who was now being disarmed by Apache warriors, and at Elias, and they felt the crushing weight of their own monumental, terrible ignorance. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Stoneheart's warriors tended to Elias's wounds with a skill that surpassed any town doctor. Elara, whose true name, Mourning Dove, was now spoken with reverence by the fierce warriors who were her people, never left his side. She held his hand, whispering his name over and over again, as if she was afraid the silence might reclaim her if she stopped. Stoneheart made a promise that day. The Thorn Creek Ranch would forever be a place of peace, protected by his people. The war of sorrow was over. He had found his daughter. The town of Redemption Gulch never laughed at Elias Thorne again. The story of that evening became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. They spoke of the day the Apache cried, and the day they all learned that a man's true worth is not measured by what he owns, but by what he is willing to protect. And at the center of it all were Elias and Elara, two silent souls who had found a language all their own, a language that had saved them all. The week that followed the siege was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. The heavy, lonely silence of trauma had been replaced by the soft stillness of healing. Elias lay in his bed, his shoulder expertly bound, his head still throbbing. But the physical pain was just a distant hum beneath a feeling of deep, bone-settling peace he hadn't known since before the war. The source of that peace sat in a chair beside him, her hand resting on his. He was still getting used to the sound of her voice. It wasn't a flood of pent-up words, but a calm, flowing river. She spoke deliberately, as if reacquainting herself with the shape of each word. And in the long hours of his recovery, she told him everything. She told him her name was Morning Dove. She spoke of her childhood in the mountains, of learning the ways of the deer and the hawk. She spoke of the day the soldiers came, not with anger, but with a deep, haunting sorrow that made Elias's own ghosts of war rise up in shared grief. When they took me, she explained, her gaze distant, the words were stolen, not by the blow to my head, but by the fear. To speak was to give them a piece of me, and I had nothing left to give. So I became a stone. I became silent. She paused, her eyes meeting his. Until you. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry whisper. She squeezed his hand. You did not try to take anything from me, Elias Thorne. You gave. You gave me safety. You gave me patience. You gave me a home. You built a place so quiet, I could finally hear my own voice waiting to come back. On the fifth day, a lone rider approached. It was Sheriff Beaumont. He dismounted, holding his hat in his hands like a schoolboy about to be punished. Mr. Thorne, he began, not looking him in the eye. Ma'am, I've come on behalf of Redemption Gulch to offer our most profound apology. We were blinded by fear and by the lies of a hateful man. There's no excuse for what we did. Where is Slocum? Elias asked, his voice flat. Locked up. A federal marshal is on his way from Tucson. He'll face charges of attempted murder and inciting a riot. His men, they've all given testimony against him. The whole town is ashamed, Thorne. Terribly ashamed, if there is anything we can do. Elias looked at Morning Dove. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. They needed nothing from the town that had scorned them. Just leave us in peace, Sheriff, Elias said. That will be enough. Beaumont nodded, a look of both relief and deep sadness on his face. He left a crate of supplies on the porch, a silent offering, and rode away. 2 days later, another party arrived. This time they came not with shame, but with honor. Stoneheart returned with only 2 warriors. He dismounted and approached the porch where Elias, now strong enough to sit up, was waiting with Morning Dove. The great chief's eyes, once filled with the fire of war, were now soft with the light of a father. He presented Elias with a gift, a beautifully crafted bow. It was not a weapon of war, but a tool for a provider, a symbol of respect. My daughter speaks your name, Stoneheart said, with Morning Dove translating, her voice the seamless bridge between their 2 worlds. She chose to stand with you. My heart was broken to lose her, but it is healed to see she found a man of honor. The land of Thorn Creek is sacred to my people now. You are family. You will never be alone. That evening, they shared a meal on the porch. A former soldier, a chief's daughter, and a warrior father, all under the same canopy of stars. After Stoneheart departed, leaving his daughter in the world she had chosen, Elias and Morning Dove sat in their usual chairs. The creek whispered in the night air. Morning Dove, Elias said, testing her true name on his tongue. It felt right. She smiled, a genuine, beautiful smile that lit up her entire face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. My father calls me that, she said. But I like Alara too. It was the name you gave me when I had none. It was the first gift. He reached out and took her hand. The silence was gone, but the peace remained, deeper and richer than before. The town no longer laughed. The Apache no longer cried in sorrow. And on a small, protected ranch, a man and a woman who had been brought together by cruelty and loss looked toward the horizon, ready to build a future, not of silence, but of shared words, shared dreams, and a love that had proven strong enough to bring 2 warring worlds to peace. In the vast, untamed expanse of the Old West, stories were often written in gunpowder and blood. But the greatest legends are the ones written by the human heart. The tale of Elias Thorne and his silent bride, Morning Dove, is a testament to the enduring power of kindness in a world brimming with cruelty. It reminds us that courage isn't about the loudness of your voice, but the strength of your convictions. And that understanding can bridge even the deepest of divides. Their story proves that sometimes the quietest people hold the most powerful truths. If this story of unlikely love, hidden strength, and redemptive courage moved you, Please take a moment to click that like button and share it with others who appreciate tales from the forgotten corners of history. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring the drama and spirit of the Wild West back to life. Thank you for listening.